All right, welcome back to part 2 of lecture 8 on how teams actually coordinate. In this second part, we will continue looking at what we call representation and how this is supported or not by discretionary behavior, creating sort of the effect in what we call teams. So you remember these surgeons that we were talking about in the first part. Now we basically conclude that if they have a communication with each other or a communicative pattern in which they sort of cover a lot of different aspects of what they're doing, the chances for them to sort of be able to communicate intelligently increase. And this is a way of illustrating the same thing. This is from a study of management teams. And what they studied was their communicative pattern. What they basically did was identify the performance level of these management teams and then sort them, preparing for the study. And the thesis behind this, or the hypothesis, was that if we can differentiate these management teams on performance, and there is an importance in communication and collective intelligence, we should be able to see a difference in the pattern these teams communicate if we compare the high performance and the low performance. And that's exactly what happened as well. So what they did was over time follow these groups in different meetings and then sort of code how they were talking, not the details of their discussions, because that was of course different in different teams, but they sort of meta-categorized their conversation in categories like inquiring and advocating. And what is that then? Well, inquiring is basically if you sort of ask questions and try to get more information, get more perspectives, get more understandings. Then you ask questions like, for example, what is this? How does it work? What should we be looking at? And so on. That would be classified as inquiring. And then as opposed to that, you have when people sort of have ideas. And they come up with suggestions and they come up with arguments for supporting their suggestions. And these are, two steps in the process of solving a problem. So what they found out was that in the high-performing teams, the high-performing third of these 60 management teams, then they spent on average as much time inquiring as they did advocating. So they had sort of a balance. They had as much inquiring comments as advocating comments. But in the low performing teams, they tended to have much more focus on different forms of advocating. And the same happened when they compared self and others. Self and others means that if you classify a comment as self, it means that you are arguing out of your perspective. That is your personal perspective. It's your department or the group versus something else, or the company versus something else, right? So that would be classified as arguing from a self perspective. Arguing from an other's perspective means that you are trying to think or argue as someone else. It could be someone else in the group, or it could be you thinking about, so what would customers feel about this, or something like that. But the point is, it's you trying to sort of look at things from someone else's perspective. And again, you can see from the graph that the high performers, they spend about as much time looking at things from their own perspective as they were trying to see things from others' perspective. And again, the low performers were basically focusing on their own perspective. And the difference was quite huge. As I think I've said earlier, the difference in inquiring between low and high performing teams was that the high performing teams spent 2,300% more time on inquiring. And of course, you can explain this if you understand the example of the surgeons, where what they're doing to sort of find all the different aspects of a situation means that you're going to have to do a lot of inquiring. You remember there were cost issues, there were hospital issues, there were patient issues, there were risks, and so on and so on. To find them all, or a lot of them at least, means you're going to have to spend a lot of time on inquiring. But that also increases your chances of then finding solutions that are, let's say, intelligent from more perspectives than others, than in the other case, if you're too narrow what you're looking at. The interesting background for this study was also that this is the result they sort of expected from the study, but the question, one of the hypotheses was, or the questions behind the study was, so why do teams tend to develop differently or create these different communicative patterns? And you couldn't really see any differences when it came to things like level of education, how long they've been working together, work experience, and things like that. Instead, they had this hypothesis coming from studies of couples, where the assumption was that it could be explained by the way people in the group were listening, or rather showing how they listen. And this was measured by something called P/N ratio. P/N ratio is just the relationship between what you could call positive responses and negative responses to what is said. It is the signal other people send back when they're listening. And it's a very simple assumption, really, that if people feel that they are listened to, they get positive responses, not necessarily meaning that the other people like or agree what they're saying, but they show that they are listening to what is said and using what you're saying in their own reasoning and so on. That is P, or positive. Now, if this ratio is high, the assumption, of course, is that will trigger people to continue talking, to continue sort of sending information if they feel that they're listened to. And that seemed like this correlation was so strong, so that it seemed like this could actually explain the difference in these communicative patterns. And this view that it's actually the communicative pattern, or what is said, is more governed by how by the listening than the speaking, is supported by other studies. For example, this one, where they did basically they did what you could call intelligence tests with groups. Like you can do individually, you can do an intelligence test, and that is measuring your general ability to solve problems, you could say, or act intelligently, or it's rather measuring your capacity for that. In the same way, they had these different teams do the same kind of intelligence tests to figure out whether there's a factor like that in groups as well. And the answer was yes. And they call that a C factor. That is you could say it's the general intelligence of the group. And so they found this variation. And then, of course, they wanted to know what is explaining this variation. And there could, of course, be many different explanations to that. But today, as of today, the strongest explanatory factor, or the factor having the strongest correlation with group intelligence, is this. It is the RME test, or the average social responsiveness of the group. An RME test is it was developed to measure things like Asperger's syndrome and different kinds of autism, where people have problems reading others' social reactions. But even if you're not categorized as having this problem, like it's a disturbance or anything, we still, as normal people, have a variation in this. And if your group has a high average capability in this respect, they score high on the RME test. That is, as of today, the best predictor of collective intelligence in groups, or groups scoring high on intelligence tests, which we could interpret as if you remember the metaphor with the football players, where the part of their ability to coordinate at this high level is because they can actually read the game. They can see what's going on around them, and they can read the field and so on. You can interpret this as a way that these are people, if they have high levels of RME on their RME tests, they have a high ability to read the game in the room, what's happening, what kind of reactions they get, how they can adjust what they want to say if they want their message to be transmitted, and so on. So that's one way of looking at how this social capability relates to knowledge integration. So this brings us into discretionary behavior. I tried to demonstrate how a representation grows out of the way people talk to each other, and in that sense they build up this picture, or this background in which they can work when they want to do intelligent things. And now we're trying to show where this comes from. This of course comes from the way people do talk to each other and the way they do relate to each other, and turning our focus on to the individuals of the group, then we can see this factor that's called discretionary behavior. And discretion is, of course, it means that it's the behavior that is under the control of the person rather than the organization or the structure. And so you could say, high level of discretionary behavior is when a person take a lot of personal initiatives to support the group or the organization, and help it to work. And I just want to illustrate this by this example, where you can see a theoretical picture of two persons attending the same meeting. But as you can understand, what I want to show you here is that depending on their discretionary behavior, they can react very differently and act very differently in relation to the same meeting. You could have an extreme to the right, where a person is rather off, or not very involved in the meeting, maybe thinking about other things, not very focused, not very participative, and maybe have a sort of distant attitude towards the group, or just relating to known individuals and so on, which means that his or her network isn't growing. And so you can imagine this person, and then you can imagine another person that for some reason is much more involved. It's the same meeting, and they may have the same skills, bringing the same skills or knowledge into the meeting, but this person for some reason is much more involved, is thinking about what is said, is thinking about things that is triggered by what is said, that maybe when I hear this, maybe I should call my colleague and inform them about this, or I make a suggestion, or I double check an issue, and things like that. So overall, you can think about these small circles sort of marking different initiatives that this person, due to their own discretionary behavior, trigger based on the same meeting. And it's rather enough if you just think about, there's some kind of variation in this as well. And then we can sort of move on and use this as a logic and look at, what would then happen if we had these different levels of discretionary behavior, and we think about, the number of meetings people have during a week, and we multiply that with the number of people and so on, and then you can see here I'm trying to illustrate that to the left you have people's discretionary behavior here as small circles. Every such moment is helping this organization to work and to be coordinated. There are some recent studies from Cross, Revel and Grant 2016 showing that it seems like just 3 to 5% of all the employees in organizations normally are responsible for somewhere between 20 to 35% of all coordination in the organization, which is, kind of interesting. What would happen if we could get a higher percentage of the employee wanting to do the same thing, basically? And there's other recent studies showing that one single high coordinating person can have more influence to a team performance than all of the other team members together. So we see that this factor in sort of creating efficiency in organization is very unevenly distributed among the employees, which of course brings us to another question. What makes people want to have high discretionary behavior? And there's some theory on this called commitment theory. It's quite interesting because it shows that whether people act with high discretionary behavior or not is very little governed by the things we tend to believe govern organizations, like plans, objectives, incentive systems, and things like that. Instead, they point to what I'm trying to show here with the graph or with the illustration is that in the middle you have the white arrow called where is some kind of focal behavior. Focal behavior is the behavior that we can design, instruct, and supervise in other people. We can see this is happening. And then, but in order to function at a workplace and actually perform a work role, you would have to add a lot of personal initiatives that you can't sort of fit into a role description or follow up on. So it's all the initiatives that people help the role with in order to get it to work or become something. And we're interested here in the level of blue here, because if you think about the arrow focal behavior and you just have a little blue discretionary behavior, that means that the person is helping its role to function less than with a lot of blue. And the highest factor affecting this seems to be something called effective commitment. And that can easily be explained as the person having his or her own desire to do this. It's sort of a involvement in the cause of the organization or this task or this role. And that is things that has to do with ultimately whether your ideas of how things should work, your values are in line with what this organization is doing. If you want the same thing as the organization, well, you can understand, and it means a lot to you, you can understand that, of course, you would be trying to help the organization succeed as much as possible. Most of us, though, are not employed or working at a workplaces with that level of commitment. To a lot of people, work is just, a way of making an income. Maybe, it's they've chosen a line of work which they find interesting and so on, but they're not that committed as in effective desire and effective commitment. What is then governing the level of discretionary behavior? Well, according to this theory, then what's governing is what's called normative commitment. It is the idea you have in your head how you act in this organization. How much effort do you put in? How much trouble do you go through in order to make something work that hasn't been very well planned? If you see that there's information lacking or communication lacking? Do you have the normative idea that, yeah, well, that's the way it is in this organization, and we all believe that we should help that work? Or do you believe that, well, there's a limit to how much initiative I have to take, and where the organization, it's actually the organization's problem and they should solve this, or it's the manager should be responsible for this, and so on. So you can see that different organizations can have different norms on how much effort you're actually supposed to add as an individual on your own initiative. And the lowest level is something called continuance. Best way to explain that is it's a person who is working in this role, has this employment, but really would like to do something else. But for different reasons, that person feel it's not possible to change things. It might be you've been working here too long, you're not prepared to go out and look for new work, or you feel that financially you're dependent of this salary, or other things that sort of ties you to this role that you already have grown tired of, or don't feel that this is not what you want to do. So that would be working at continuous level, and that could be a fairly dangerous level to work at, because continuance means that a lot of people would in such a situation feel trapped, and the natural reaction to that as a human being is to work against the things that you feel trap you. So here's where you can actually find people having what you could call negative discretionary behavior. They're sort of working on a level where they make some sort of resistance to the organization, or could actually, deliberately be troublesome and so on, if you're in this state. Oh, so coming back to the representation, then we can add something. If the representation, it seems like it sort of fulfills two different functions. One is to support the cognitive process with different perspectives, ideas, and relationships, and so on, so that you're working with, this is what you have to work with when you solve problems. The other thing is that it seems that within the representation there is also the perspective ideas that could support your effective commitment. If you have a very developed representation, it means that this idea of what's happening and what's going on theoretically allows for more effective commitment, because it allows for more ideas on how you could align your individual values in relation to this situation, task, or organization. So not only does a team that has a developed representation create more thoughts for brain, but it also creates more ideas to which you could connect and find motivation in why you're doing this. But now it seems like we've sort of sent rather a negative picture of organizations with people having a standard defensive behavior and so on. Therefore, I would also like to point to this phenomenon called swift trust. Swift trust is sort of an alternative to defensive behavior. It has shown in different studies of some teams like film crews or ad hoc project teams and so on in certain consulting organizations, that people tend to not start off with defensive behavior, but the opposite. They seem to start working with a certain trust level, although they don't know each other, they haven't met before. And that is thought to be able to, that we can explain this by this phenomenon called swift trust. That is something is supported by very clear knowledge roles where people know what's expected from them, like in a film crew. We know what the cameraman is supposed to do, the sound engineer, and so on. So people are fairly confident in their own role and how that relates to other roles, and so on. There seems to be needed some kind of pride in which you sort of connect your own pride to your own role. It's good to be known. I'm a very well-known cameraman that people have done a good job in previous productions, and this personal trademark is important to people. There's a likelihood that you will meet again, meaning that sort of you're protecting your reputation, or this is sort of a small business, and people who are good at this tend to meet again in other productions and so on. And finally, that there is some kind of central figure like the director with a good reputation who seems to work like giving sort of a trust to his or her ability to select good people to work with. So if people feel these four things, they seem to be able to start working as if they've known each other for a long time and become a fairly efficient team already. It's like they work with the benefit of doubt, that I will trust you and I will believe that you're good at what you're doing and that we can work together until the opposite is proven, sort of. This is interesting to know, because of course then if organizations could find the mechanisms of creating this as their standard behavior rather than defensive behavior, it would mean that they could have much higher levels of efficiency much earlier in their teams. So that was a long lecture, I'm sorry for that, just to summarize quickly, the representation, or how the members of the microsystem understands their task and situation, contributes to collective intelligence if it has requisite variety. That is, it's developed enough to make them able to deal with all relevant aspects of the task, but not so complex that it makes them incapable of finding ways forward. So intelligence is on the border to chaos, or the highest level of intelligence is on the border to chaos. That the representation is shared between the members enough to enable the exchange of knowledge, but not shared to an extent where they have no unique knowledge contributions, of course. Intelligent representations are constantly changing and a result of an ongoing communication within the team. It's not a fixed thing, it's rather a process. Collective intelligence is enacted through the members' discretionary behavior. If they are heedful, the microsystem becomes heedful. Representation and discretionary behavior is mutually dependent of each other. A rich and vivid representation supports effectively committed discretionary behavior, which in turn tends to develop the representation, and so on. Defensive behavior can, under certain conditions, be avoided by what is called swift trust. Thank you very much.